I teach people how to be strong in difficult situations. The truth is, martial arts isn't just about punching and kicking or about choking and arm barring. It's really learning how to gain strength and be strong on the mat, but more importantly, off the mat. No one really gives us a real guidebook for how to behave in this ever-changing world. And if you can give someone opportunities to develop capacities to be strong, it's going to be able to be used in multiple domains.
What you're about to hear is a conversation I recently had with my good friend, Sensei Mike Valentine, who along with his wife, Sensei Karen Valentine, runs a martial arts school in Northern California called Practical Martial Arts. It is the best example of a martial arts school I've ever seen that teaches an integrated mixed martial arts curriculum to kids and teens, and not only teaches them how to fight and defend themselves, but really works to develop their resilience and their character. I hope you appreciate this discussion. You'll notice that Mike has a lot of knowledge about neuroscience, and he shares some of that. So sit back and enjoy my conversation with Mike Valentine. I know that a lot of you are watching the show, but not as many are hitting subscribe. It would really help to get the show out there, and we'll make sure you get notified when new episodes go live. So please do subscribe, ding that bell, and I'll be honored to have you as part of the community. Welcome to the Ageless Warrior Lab. I'm BJJ Black Belt and Dirty Dozen member Dave Meyer, here to draw wisdom from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the martial arts and explore how it applies to success in business, relationships, your long-term health, and making the most out of your life. Mike, it's great to be talking to you.
It's fantastic to be talking to you, David. It really is. I mean, you've been a huge impact on my martial art training for all these decades, and it's an honor to be here. It's an absolute honor. I'm very excited.
Well, thank you. And I think you have a lot to offer for the people who are in our new and growing audience. I think you are a great example of what I would call an ageless warrior. I mean, none of us are truly ageless.
Unfortunately not.
We're feeling our age. But you're a person who is a very successful teacher, martial arts school owner, fighter in a number of different styles, and like me, you continue to train with the young guys. In fact, we trained together on the same mat in Fairfax.
Absolutely.
Black Sheep with Wolf and Danny. You have a very interesting point of view, and so I'm really glad to get a chance to let you share that with my audience.
It would be a pleasure. When people ask me what I do for a living, I really respond with an odd comeback, which is I teach people how to be strong in difficult situations. Very often I'll get a raised eyebrow or a head nod, and I'm really waiting for someone to call me on it, like, okay, what do you mean? That's such a weird thing to say. The truth is, martial arts isn't just about punching and kicking or about choking and arm barring. It's really learning how to gain strength and be strong on the mat, but more importantly, off the mat. And the way we do that is by giving our students optimal moments to challenge themselves amidst the struggle inherent within the martial arts. If you start that as your first principles when you're conceptualizing something, then it's way beyond a punch or a kick or a wrestling move. I focus on mainly children or teens. I do have adult students, but I find that has the most impact. No one really gives us a real guidebook for how to behave in this ever-changing world. And if you can give someone opportunities to develop capacities to be strong, it's going to be able to be used in multiple domains.
It's funny because people say no one gives you a guidebook to be a parent, right? No one gives you a guidebook to be a martial arts instructor, right? Anybody can open up a martial arts school, and usually people do it because they are practitioners and they just want to get paid for the thing they like, but they've never studied how to teach. They're not usually thinking about how to run a business or anything like that. One of the things that I think is so unique about what I see at your school, which you run along with your wife, Karen, it is, first of all, a fantastic school. The way you bring up young people is just extraordinary. The way you are teaching them life lessons along with fighting is very realistic. It's what anyone would call MMA. They're punching, kicking, and they're learning takedowns and jiu-jitsu, all appropriate to their age level. But I don't see anybody else doing it. Everywhere else where people are teaching a comprehensive fighting system, what we might call MMA to kids, it's usually in an MMA gym where some mid-level student is coming in to basically mind the kids and have them have some fun, and it's good stuff.
Absolutely.
It's not really thought out about how you're going to bring these kids forward and how you're going to develop them across all levels like what you're talking about. How did you come on to that? What made you start getting switched on to the need to be that kind of a really good mentor and a teacher to people?
Martial arts changed me over time. When I was young, I started martial arts in 1973, and I was in TaeKwonDo. My instructor was a rather grumpy, elderly Korean man who I think I really annoyed him because I was one of those kids where the attention was all over the place. My grandparents would drop me off. I would run into the bathroom and change, and it was back when you had those uniforms didn't have elastic, so you'd have to tie your pants. So I'd run out there and literally my pants would fall down. He would just look at me and just think, oh my God, he had to endure me for all this time. And it wasn't that pleasurable for me. It wasn't that fun. And I didn't really like it until when I was 9 years old, one of my babysitters decided to show me the R-rated Enter the Dragon. And I saw Bruce Lee, and it just changed my whole perspective on martial arts and on life. I mean, there was Bruce Lee, like the closest thing I had ever seen to a superhero come to life. His superpower wasn't because he got bit by a radioactive spider. It was through force of his own will. And that changed everything. I went from being unmotivated and unfocused to being the kind of person who would train, even at a very young age, every day at the martial art academy and then come home and train. And it was just having that abstract representation where I wanted to go or what I could be that Bruce Lee personified. And even to this day, it affects me.
He inspired a lot of people. Obviously, he was an action hero, but he was a very serious and very real martial artist who died tragically very young. I know Dan Inosanto, who used to train with Bruce. Never heard a bad thing about Bruce Lee and his training in martial arts, a truly great martial artist. So how did you make the leap into teaching a school and creating this institution in Northern California that you have now? And I just have to say, it is so common for me to meet extraordinarily good martial artists in different arts who all tell me that they started out at your school.
It's wonderful when they come back and visit the dojo. I'm lucky to have a lot of good relationships with a lot of my former students. And I think the key to that as a teacher is to expect your student to want to have accomplished everything you have times 3. And the more you can serve them to that end, the longer you're going to keep your relationship with them. I have about 6 of my students having their own schools, but they all have different ways of doing things than me. And I love it. I go to a lot of their gyms and I learn new things. A sensei means someone who's walked a path, someone who's walked before. I've walked this far and they're going to want to walk farther than me, but I can help them with this much. They sometimes call me and I can tell them the mistakes I've done over the last 30 years. And that seems to be my best form of advice for any of them.
It's funny that you mention that because making mistakes is how we learn in martial arts, right? If you learn some new technique in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or anything else and it works perfectly the first time you do it, you're like, well, that's good. Now we move on to the next thing. You don't really tend to explore it. But sometimes when you struggle with something, it is through the struggle where we develop a much greater knowledge of something and a much greater awareness.
Well, I think the thing to understand is it's all about the struggle. If you have the capacity to do 5 push-ups, it's not doing them 5 over and over and over again that's going to make you stronger. It's the 6th you can't do. That's what's going to signal your nervous system to adapt and change. The struggle in that moment, when you're doing that push-up, when all of a sudden that actin and myosins are decoupling, you're having trouble, it sends a message that produces a lot of changes at a neurological level, not just the muscle, but the way that it structures your nervous system as well as your mind. As you're struggling, you have cortisol and dynorphins, which is kind of the exact opposite of endorphins. When you feel good about something, dynorphins is one of these things that limits you under stress. And it makes you feel the discomfort you feel, which makes you kind of stop. But if you start pushing through that, your nervous system recalibrates and it allows you to follow through with your actions, whereas you would stop before. The important things in martial arts, in particular, let's say MMA and jiu-jitsu, is you have one person working with another person who's trying to basically manifest an outcome. And the other person is trying to manifest an outcome as well, but it's not the same outcome. Right. That's the moment where iron sharpens iron. And that's the moment when you have this adaptation. As a teacher, that's where you have to be a good coach. Number one, pair your students. I never just say, okay, everybody grab a partner and roll. I'm always making sure everybody has the right partner to have that ideal moment of struggle. Sometimes it doesn't happen, a lot of the times it doesn't, but you want to try and you want to be aware. And then I think probably one of the most important things that people need to understand is in that moment of struggle, if you're underneath the person and you're being squished, your mind has two places to go, and they have two different neural networks. So when you're under stress, the radar part of your brain, called the insular cortex, looks for what's going on. It sends a message to your cingulate cortex, which is like the pilot of the brain. So you have your radar and you have your pilot. Now the pilot is two buttons. It can send a message to the control tower. Can you imagine if you're flying a plane? And that's where your central executives part of your brain says, I got a plan for you, and let's do this. Or it sends it to the amygdala, which is where your fear is processed. And then all of a sudden cortisol, more dynorphins get expressed, and all of a sudden you feel overwhelmed. And very often that goes in a loop. So I call it the yucky loop. So if a kid's underneath someone and they're going inside, it's going to be hard for them to focus on taking an action to change the outcome. And that's where a coach comes in and says, the person's sitting on their belly, hey, grab the wrist, bridge, upa. And all of a sudden, instead of going to the amygdala, it uses a different network, which allows you to manifest an action which is going to allow you to change what's happening. And as a coach, you're there trying to help them facilitate that switching to the task positive network, not the fear network. And that's what we do. So whenever people say, oh, you can't teach heart, well, this is how you do it. In the moment, coaching them when they need it the most. That's why I have our instructors coach the person that's losing. You know, very often you'll see someone, especially young instructors, they'll teach the person to do a 360 arm bar or whatever, and it's like, great, as this person's getting mauled. You're trying to develop their capacity to act under stress. And that's the most important thing. And then you try and help the student do it in as many environments as they possibly can to globalize the behavior. Because very often we develop a set of behaviors in one domain for the mat, but they're absolute wimps outside the mat because it doesn't carry over. So the more they do it in different places and keep track of it, and that's the parent's job. And ideally, if there can be a conversation between the instructor and the parent to facilitate this expectation and nurturing, then all of a sudden you get someone who can dramatically change their behavior. And then if that happens over time, it changes their personality. And that's the goal of what we're trying to do here. But it all has to start from a real accomplishment, from real struggle. I've seen people with tremendous challenges starting off with this process, but slowly build themselves up to being able to be remarkably capable. I have a child with special needs, so I understand there is a nature component and there is a nurture component. Psychology has found it's kind of 50-50, especially when they look at twin studies, things like that. There's a lot of nature that goes on there, but there's a lot of nurture. And if we can work on those type of skills, then we'll be relevant to people on and off the mat. And I think that's the greatest way we can serve them.
I want to go back to one thing you said, which is you were talking about how it's that sixth push-up, or it's the point at which you're failing that's important. Just from a being in shape point, this is something I always pay attention to. Generally speaking, I run my own workouts. So if I push myself, I get pushed. If I don't push myself, I don't get pushed. You get to decide when you're doing that, are you doing another rep? Are you doing another sprint? And so I have this rule that I do not let myself at the difficult moment make the decision that I'm stopping. I wait until after I rest, and then I make the decision if I'm doing another set, so that part of my brain that's saying, I just can't do another sprint. Of course you feel that way when you're at the end of that sprint, right. But give yourself a couple seconds of rest. Now, you sure you can't do another one? And what I tell myself in there, and it's similar to what you were saying, but again, it's just for getting into shape purposes, is the first sprint or the first rep is not the one that's making you better.
Right.
It's the last one. You've put all this effort in. You've got your gym clothes on, or you've gone to the gym, or you put your running shorts on, and you've done all this stuff, and you've cleared the time. You're out there, and you've spent an hour to get to this beautiful moment where you are really tired, and your muscles are worked really hard, or you're really out of breath. And that's where the improvement happens, both physically and psychologically.
It is. And that moment of rest is really interesting because as you're straining, the dynorphins, the negative feeling is going up, but endorphins are happening at a lower level. In order for you to start the process, you have to have a certain amount of dopaminergic involvement. So that kind of starts it off. And then the dynorphin, as it comes up, diminishes the amount of dopamine for you to actually have the desire to finish at that high level, and you start losing the gas tank of dopamine. When you rest, then all of a sudden it goes away. The endorphins will kick up, and also the dopamine will kick up, and then you'll feel like, I want another try. What I find fascinating is the utility of failure and how it can help us. I was listening to a Andrew Huberman podcast, and he was talking about learning. And one of the things he was talking about was what happens when you fail, when you ask a question and you get it wrong. And what happens is, in that little moment, there are 3 neurotransmitters that tend to make a tiny bookmark in your brain: dopamine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. And they'll put a placeholder right there. So whenever you get close to that again, your radar in your brain goes, oh, this is important, so I'm going to put more resources towards dealing with this. Imagine that from a grappling perspective. I know they do this somewhat in ecological jiu-jitsu, where they're trying to play games all the time to get this. Some of it makes sense. I still think you need to work on the technique personally. That's my interpretation.
Me too.
But there are interesting parts about ecological jiu-jitsu, and especially doing specific rolling for an objective, even when you are unable to apply it, which is very common, especially when your opponent knows that you're working it. But even just trying to do it, it puts a bookmark in your brain, so there's a greater chance of you being able to do it the next time you train. So that whole idea of failing forward, I think, is really appropriate, and having a tolerance for failing is part of resilience and part of being strong, and having that as part of your mat culture. John Will talks about mat culture. I've only interacted with him 3 times, and each time he blew my mind and changed the way I taught. He made me more aware of what is the mat culture that we're trying to produce to get people collectively moving in the direction together in the optimal way.
That's very important. You're not the only person interacting with everybody. The students are interacting with themselves, your assistant coaches are interacting with people, and that's where that culture comes in. Is it a culture where you make people feel bad about things? Is it a culture where you're trying to make people scared? I mean, there's different cultures.
Absolutely.
But you need to set the culture, and of course John also talks about how that has to be reinforced all the time. One bad apple can mess up the culture.
In very physical martial arts, like wrestling, judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, we have to be there for everybody. We have to be there for the ones winning the tournaments, but also the people that are struggling. And there has to be an equal emphasis on value of those students. And frankly, as a teacher, those struggling students that you can have a large impact with are the ones that you should be proudest of. And I think those are certain things that we have to always be aware of if we're teaching where merit is based on competence and your ability to do well against resisting opponents.
Not everybody's going to be able to do that, but there still could be much more impressive growth happening in someone who maybe doesn't achieve that level, but look at what they've overcome.
A person who has 10 out of 10 physiological gifts and they maximize those, great. And then you have a person who has a 3, then all of a sudden they're doing an amazing job because you've really helped them along this process. We want to have a place for both. And I think that's important to your mat culture. This is at the ground floor of everything, mutual respect for everyone. I look at modern martial arts as being better than it's ever been, but worse than it's ever been.
What does that mean?
In many dojos, one can put in the time and be rewarded, regardless of their competence. And it really does the students a disservice.
You mean being rewarded with a higher belt rank?
Higher belt rank, but a good portion of people come to martial arts because maybe ball sports weren't their thing, or other things that just weren't their thing. So they come to this and they learn a physical skill. I had a database that I wrote 25 years ago, which asked our parents, what was the number one reason you brought your children in here? And it was always confidence. But confidence has to come from competence. Mm-hmm. If confidence is built on a person's perceived rank or verbal positive reinforcement from a coach without them being able to actually manifest a certain outcome, then it's a disservice.
False confidence.
It's false confidence, and it's so unfair to the student because they'll maybe interact with one of their peers and all of a sudden they'll be on the receiving end of something they weren't prepared for. You can't remove struggle from merit. And I think that's the important thing. And I think there are schools that people term McDojos, where that's the thing that makes a McDojo is merit without struggle. And I'd say that's the thing that we have to guard against as a community. It doesn't mean everybody has to do MMA, but we have to figure out ways that students, I mean, if you're doing Tai Chi, then make them do push-ups and burpees or something like that, where they have to struggle. There has to be that element within it, no matter what the style. And I think at the bare minimum, we should be about pushing ourselves physically. Ideally, we should be in the best physical shape, because a lot of those benefits that we're talking about happen in moments of resistance training, cardiovascular training. Those are all helping develop neurological strength as well as physical strength.
I think what you're talking about is the ability to ascend through the belt ranks in various martial arts without actually having some level of competence. That sounds like that's a worse time. That's something that's bad.
Right.
Why is this good time for martial arts?
When I was coming up in traditional martial arts, I trained in about 5 different ones. There were some amazing things, but there were a few martial arts where I really felt like the person who created the martial arts never was in a real fight before. I was a hyper-aggressive kid and a bit of a bully, and it got me into several real fights. And sometimes I was on the receiving end, and sometimes I was being a little idiot thug on the giving end. And I did know what real punches to the face felt like, and I knew what it was like in a real fight. And I felt like a lot of the arts that I had dealt with didn't have a resisting opponent as it would be in a real fight. I don't want to put anyone else down, but it was just a feeling I had. So I was always trying to, I mean, because of Bruce Lee, to adopt his idea, absorb what's useful, discard what's useless, even at a very young age. And I always had, for me personally, the measure of sparring, you know, putting on the gloves with people.
I agree.
And sometimes when I thought I was hot stuff doing point fighting, I had a friend who was an amateur boxer. I thought I was going to Bruce Lee him, and he Rocky Balboa'd me. And I started training and competing in amateur boxing soon after. When I thought I was hot stuff in that, I had a friend who was a wrestler and a judoka, and he judoka'd me pretty well. And that kind of gave me an idea about martial art training and fighting. And then when I actually saw UFC, and saw Hoist Gracie, what he did, it was like watching a Jedi Knight on a much higher level, you know, actually manifest what I thought martial arts was supposed to be, a 170-pound man fighting these monsters, and just taking them down and controlling them and submitting them. It was incredible. It was equally as life-changing as watching Bruce Lee.
Well, I think it's probably true that the origins of all martial arts did involve some fighting, but frequently it's not a fighting that is culturally relevant to us. So it might have been people in Japan having to use farm implements to defend themselves against some marauding force coming in on horses, and therefore there's a lot of stick work and things like that, certainly sword work, or even with punching and kicking, a place where people are not grappling. And then, of course, there's always the tension between live, realistic practice and injury and toning it down so you can practice it without getting hurt. But I think over decades and centuries, if you tone it down too much, you get to what is a bit more like a dance, where you're not actually having any resistance at all. So if all you're ever doing is throwing punches in the air, you can still be gaining speed, and there's a lot of good things you can get from that. But it would be like trying to play basketball without a basketball in a net, just going like this with your hand.
Right.
It's a little different when there's actually a ball and someone's putting their hand in your face.
I would agree. The thing is, it's not like everything has to be full contact.
Right.
And at nearly 60 years old, I grapple other black belts in jiu-jitsu, and I have a great time. And I'm going at level 10, but these guys are IBJJF competitors. I mean, world-class guys. And they're going at level 3. So if they were going on their level 10, I'd be done. I'd be literally in the hospital.
You need some real feedback.
You need feedback. You need some type of resistance. You need some type of stressor that's appropriate to where you're at. And I think that's the important thing. You have to be able to apply your skills in non-linear environments. You know, if it's always the same thing, it's hard to use in different situations. That's kind of what's helpful for doing MMA style, or taking the MMA style and even role-playing what happens in a street self-defense situation, like Jeff Thompson and the fence, and how to do those type of things.
So for our listeners, what Mike's talking about is You have the physical techniques within the sport. Mixed martial arts is allowing a broader variety than many sports. You could do punches and kicks. There's still limitations to not hurt people, but taking someone to the ground, finishing holds and things like that. Rehearsing actual scenarios and situations where you're bringing in the element of verbal abuse. And I've talked about this on the podcast before. And how you can incorporate that and how are you going to react in that situation, because we're all very used to our very comfortable, I'm going to train with my buddy Mike, we say, let's go. We're on the mat, we're taking it easy. And even if we're sparring seriously, it's still one-on-one. I don't have to look over my shoulder and see if anyone's going to come hit me. I don't have to worry about being thrown onto a table corner. You're not about to pull out a weapon. So keeping yourself prepared and understanding how to control a situation like that is something that needs to be intentionally worked. And most people don't work that.
I think you have to have context for your skills. I had a really good friend named Jimmy who was an unbelievable kickboxer. And he was in a party, a guy got on his face, and he kind of alphaed the guy, who didn't like it. And the second he turned his back, the guy attacked him, hit him with something upside his head. And I had no doubt that Jimmy would have wiped him out, but he wasn't able to utilize his skills within that context. So there has to be a certain amount of that as well. But also, there has to be a lot of fun on the mat. You have to balance these things out. I've been in some schools that it was so self-defense oriented that everybody's talking every 5 seconds about the boogeyman who's going to get them. It's like, I think some of that's good, but I think it's good to balance it out with a broad knowledge of bettering yourself, doing martial arts for the sake of your own self-improvement as well as self-defense.
Yeah, John Wells talked about this on this podcast as well and in other places, how there's what gets you into a sport and what keeps you there.
That's true.
And what gets you into it might be a need for self-defense. What keeps you there might be the friendships, the puzzle of jiu-jitsu, wanting to better yourself, keep yourself in shape, and they can be different things. But ultimately, if someone's going to stick around, it probably can't just be death fight every day.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to what you were talking about of how you can involve parents, in your school, how you're trying to generalize these martial arts lessons off the mat. Because that's a very big theme of this podcast, is lessons taken from the martial arts taken out into life. And here you're creating an environment where you're trying to make that happen. What do you do to try to get your students to generalize their skills?
The first thing to understand is that every student coming into the dojo is on his own Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. They're Luke Skywalker. You're Ben Kenobi. You're teaching them tools. In my case, I teach them specific psychological tools that help them be strong in difficult situations. And then I have them try and use those psychological skills within different drills where they're testing themselves, whether it's focus, motivation, belief, or perseverance. So that's what I'm trying to teach as well as everything else. So you have to understand that's what you represent to them, is that kind of mentor who's giving those skills, and then their job is to take them and actually, battle and hopefully use them, and hopefully use them outside. So what I try and do is, I think a lot of schools will teach mat chats and life skills. I do the same thing, but I do it through narrative. So what happens is I have these little stories, these little martial arts samurai stories, which contain a psychological skill. Kids are very open to stories. They hate being preached to. Narrative is amazing. When someone tells you a story, a lot of the same areas of your brain as if you actually were to do the action that's described in the story is actually fire in your brain. So it's interesting, when one person's reading a story, different areas of their brain come online, sometimes even sensory parts of the brain, motor parts of their brain, as if they were doing this. They're just not doing it.
Living it internally.
And the person who's listening, the same thing's happening. And there's a coupling, a neurocoupling, they call it, that helps people connect very often to a narrative. So I think narrative is very, very powerful. When you can have a student understand this is the process they're going through, and we're very open about it, what we want you to develop. These are the areas, and then what you're going to become. People need a goal. Like for me, Bruce Lee, and later on, Hoist Gracie, and meeting Rickson Gracie really was important to me. It really helped give me an idea about, okay, this is the goal. Now, am I ever going to reach the goal of being a Rickson Gracie? No. Or Bruce Lee, but I'm going to strive towards it.
North Star.
It's your North Star. And if you have a North Star, it orients your attention. Okay, and this is actually one of my stories. It's called the North Star, ironically. It was taken from a real life story. When I was young, I started training, and a friend of me, kind of friend, kind of enemy, started afterwards. He was a foot taller, could do the full splits, unbelievably strong, unbelievably athletic. And he just left me in the dust as far as belt wise. But I was a child of a single mother. Martial art training was cheap childcare. So very often I would just walk to the dojo, and being motivated by Bruce Lee, I started training every day. I was training all the time. He was good at a million different sports. So he was maybe coming in 2 days a week. Though he had passed me by early on, I started getting better and better. Eventually, when we sparred, I got the better of him, which I was very happy with. He decided to quit, lost motivation. And our teacher actually sent him a letter trying to get him to come back because he thought he could be a champion. Lo and behold, I met him about 20 years later, and he knew my whole bio. And we were in a gym talking, and he said, yeah, it's really hard for me that you were better than me in martial arts. And I could tell he was so talented, he had just expected things to happen for him. And I said, well, what happened? It's like, well, I just got bored. And I thought about it, and I didn't get bored. So when I would come home and do 1,000 strikes, which I did every single day since I was a child, for literally 30 years or more, that would be insanely boring for him. But for me, it was getting closer to Bruce Lee. And that was my North Star. So it made things that seemed boring not boring anymore. It lit up my life and focused my attention on things that would help me towards that goal, where he was distracted because he was good at all these other things, even though he's better than me. The idea is you perceive what you pursue. And your attention networks are focused on things that are novel or important. He was looking for novelty. But because, for me, I wanted to be Bruce Lee. So I would do 1,000 boring strikes every day. I would work my splits every day. Because for me, those weren't just exercises, they were my path to getting closer to my goal. And I think that's what a goal does. It's your North Star that helps you orient your attention. And that's what the story is about. The catchphrase is you perceive what you pursue, and the idea is you need a goal. It helps the way you perceive the world. It turns on your mental radar to think about things that are related to it, which are going to make you more inclined to do more things towards achieving that goal.
I've always been focused towards real fighting, even though I don't get into real fights. So that is what drew me to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's why I didn't just look at that and say, oh, that's interesting. I thought, oh, that's effective, right? I experienced that and wanted to jump into that. Or with the ways I try to keep my body fit, it's not just to look good.
Right.
It's to be functionally the way I want to be. And I think maybe kids lack that. You know, their parents drop them into a martial arts school. The parents have some vague goal, I assume, that they want their kids to learn discipline or be able to defend themselves or whatever. But I would imagine in most cases, young people are not raising their hand saying, I want to go into this jiu-jitsu thing because there's something I want to achieve. If they're lacking that North Star, they're not understanding, why are we doing this exercise? Why do I have to endure this problem? And I think you have found ways to inspire people to make them understand why they're doing it and to get them behind that.
Well, I think that's what narrative's about. The narrative is about sharing what's important, values and beliefs, whether it's a cultural value belief or an individual's value belief. I have 52 little samurai stories that each one of them has a psychological tool to help to adopt a specific mindset. In Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about between stimulus and response, there's a space. And he says in that space is your freedom to choose. People have said it comes from Viktor Frankl, but it really is Covey inspired by Viktor Frankl's work who started talking about it. And I really started thinking about that idea between stimulus and response. And what's between that is a state of mind. How you're thinking, how you're feeling in that moment. Now, you can think negatively about the stimulus, and you can be feeling negatively. So you're not going to deal with it. You're going to run away from it. Or you can be thinking positively, where you move forward. So a good mindset, like a warrior mindset, is one where you are going to be thinking in a positive way and feeling in a positive way to move forward towards taking an action to be able to deal with that stimulus. And a lot of what I do is try and teach through those psychological tools ways to assume a specific mindset in a specific area, whether it's focus, learning how to focus your mind in specific ways, or how do you believe in yourself, okay? You've talked about the confidence bank. That's in alignment with a Stanford psychologist called Albert Bandura, where he has 4 ways that allow you to believe in yourself. And one is moments of mastery. The other way is if a peer who's similar to you has accomplished some things. If he can do it, I can do it. So that's what I teach my kids.
You've put a lot of thought into the methods that you're using to keep yourself fit. You've done a lot of research into this. And I think a lot of the people who are watching this are interested in that and interested in how to age well in the martial arts. So what can you share about your routines? What are the things you're doing that you don't think other people are doing? And how are you staying so fit?
Ideally, you want to be fit in all the different domains of your life. So I think the whole idea of pushing your limits but knowing your limits is important, and adjusting to what your body's needs are. Your body's telling you if your knees aren't working, your back's not working, and you have to do more homework. I think a lot of people will do strength training or cardiovascular training, but I think 2 of the things that really need to be addressed are joint mobility, not just stretching. Stretching is very important, but moving through a range of motion and doing that every day. Steve Maxwell was an early proponent of this, and he's a phenomenal example of someone who can move incredibly well, and I think he's now in his 70s. I highly recommend him as a resource. And then there's the idea of moving at speed of sport. So you need to be quick. And very often when you watch a senior athlete train, they try and be quick, but their movements get very short and choppy. In grappling, you see people just kind of grabbing and holding because they can't move around as much as someone who's more agile. There are 2 things that I use that have been incredibly effective. One came from a gentleman named Marv Marinovich. He was a strength and conditioning coach for BJ Penn, and one of his proteges worked with George St. Pierre. And the idea is you're moving a small amount of weight, very, very light, and doing mini plyometrics where you're moving in one way and then dynamically, explosively moving in a different way. So in some ways, this could be really detrimental to joint health if you do it wrong, but you have to work your way up. But working with speed, doing sprinting and other things, and making sure that your system isn't compromised, that you can't do those things. So I do speed type of training where I have a small 3-pound ball, and I'll do movement patterns, kind of similar to weight training, but reversing it in order to get that kind of plyometric stretch reflex, which affects the fascia around your muscles. A lot of your explosiveness isn't just your muscles contracting, it's the fascia around your muscles that have a lot of that explosiveness, almost like you're constantly pulling rubber bands. I'll lie on a physio ball, I'll have, let's say, 3 pounds weights, and do flies, but snap them back and forth in small motions and large motions, because a lot of sports aren't full range of motion.
100%.
So you have to do both.
Right.
And then you would do a fly to all these other different movements, punching straight, yanking it forward and back, bringing it this way. And then I do the same thing with my back, same thing with my legs and my core in order to be explosive and elastic. And each one takes about 5 minutes, as hard as I possibly can. And I get my heart rate up quite high. And then after about 5 minutes, I'll take a rest, breathe, and do it again. I'll do that about 3 days a week, especially if I don't roll. If I roll, I'll use that as a warm-up. You could probably look up Marv Marinovich ball work on YouTube and try and find it. I'll try and look around and see if you can put it in your notes.
And letting our non-BJJ listeners know by rolling means grappling on the mat. Yeah,
grappling
rolling.
It's a great prime for your nervous system before you roll. I have a lot of rituals before I train. One of the things I'll do is I will work on my balance. My youngest son, who had autism and epilepsy, had a lot of physical therapy, and one of the things they would do is put him on a balance board. It was interesting how he would always seem to concentrate. So I looked it up, and one of the things that happens is the cerebellum, the lower part of your brain, will actually cue your executive function network, because when you're on an odd surface, it's like one of the worst things that can happen for your body. You fall, you get hurt. So all of a sudden, it makes your brain turn on other resources. So before I roll, I'll usually, for a minute or so, just get on a balance board and hit that.
Which would be a board like with a ball underneath it,
Yeah.
so it's just unstable.
Yeah, anything that
Right.
can put you off, if you want to just balance on one leg and move around or maybe close your eyes.
I would have said it wakes up your stabilizers So a very muscular thing. And you're saying, yeah, it might do that, but you're saying it's waking up something inside of your
No,
brain.
it actually turns on the cerebral thalamic tract, which turns on the part of your brain that is in the moment and focused. And it makes sense because if you're off balance, that means something bad's going to happen.
Right.
You need resources in order to correct it. You'll need that, being aware in the present moment, and maybe you might need to think about what to do to change it. So that's one thing. Another thing, they found that even eye movements tend to like change the way you think and turn on the focus part of your brain. And one of the things you can do is what's called verdant eye movement, where your eyes track inward and look at something. And as you do that, there's something called your dorsal attention network, where when you focus your eyes on something, very often your mind follows your eyes. So you're bringing yourself in that present moment. You're stop thinking about your future and your past. You're in the present moment. And then I'll roll after that. And I want to get my mind in a specific state before I roll. One of being focused in the present moment, relaxed but aware. And I find when I have that as a mini ritual, that my rolls are better. When I roll, I really enjoy it, but I want to savor each one because I don't roll as much as I used to. I probably roll 4 6-minute rounds when I'm rolling, and that's not much, but I do it at an intense pace with young guys, and that's what I can do. Back in the old days, we used to roll for hours and hours and hours, which is great, but I'm really careful of my partners that I roll with.
I mean, careful in selecting who you roll with.
I'm very careful. I think that's one of the things I like, rolling with my friends hard. And every now and then I'll roll with someone new and get that kind of adrenaline rush, and I'll savor that too. But I also try and savor each roll and make the most out of each roll. I think another thing is recording yourself. We have these iPhones with us all the time, using that every few weeks. Because I find I'm not drilling as much as I used to, but I'm getting better. In some ways, I feel like I'm getting better at pattern recognition. Your intuitive mind, it basically is a pattern recognition machine. You notice something, it appears, and then you act. And then there's an association with that pattern. So you don't have to think about something, you just act and do it. If I say, what's 2 plus 2? You say 4, and you don't have to think about it. But if I said, what's 13 plus 71? All of a sudden, you're having to bring that thought into your mind, add it up, and it's a different network. So like rolling, most of rolling, I feel, is just intuitive pattern recognition, and you want to have a wide variety of people doing different games so you can notice a lot of different patterns. So partners, ideally a variety of styles with your partners, appropriate intensity, tapping early. I don't fight taps the way I used to. Water conditioning is an excellent way to recover, where you imagine just doing weight training with large plastic pieces for water resistance. And then what happens is you'll get the neurological benefits of developing strength and explosiveness while pushing hard against the water, but it has less of an impact on delayed muscle soreness. And in fact, it helps your lymph system get rid of the C-reactive proteins and the yucky stuff in your body that makes you sore. So I highly recommend doing some type of water resistance if you did weight training the day before, or if you did a heavy roll the day before. You'll actually make yourself a little stronger, and it'll cue your nervous system too. I got that from Soviet sports science. They do a lot of recovery. A lot of the best research was done 30, 40 years ago. Yeah,
in the 70s.
It's really amazing. So I do a lot of water conditioning, and if I don't roll, then I'm going to do either ball work, usually ball work with water resistance together. And I feel like that's my fountain of youth, you know, a speed workout. And then there's something about water resistant that's pretty amazing that I would highly recommend everybody do. And then one day a week I do traditional weight training. I tend to use more machines now.
Just because it's safer than the instability of free weights.
I used to be really into bodybuilding and powerlifting, and I just hurt my shoulders. So I'm just trying to not injure myself more. I think water resistance is an unbelievable way of combating that more than anything else. If eventually I can't roll or do anything, I definitely will always do my water resistance.
Yeah, I think there's something just healing about water generally. There's no question about that. And of course, as a low impact exercise, swimming is great exercise. But what you're talking about is not necessarily just swimming, but doing particular motions and resistance in the water. I know that when I've had knee injuries, when you're at that point where you're trying to start to rehabilitate things, you can walk a little, but you can't move and twist. Just getting into 5 feet of water or even 4 feet of water, because it takes your weight off it. You can move left, you can move right, you can hold on to the end and gently kick your legs. And I know that part of that is the resistance, but I feel there's just something about the way the water tugs you and twists you a little bit. And there's something about being in water. And so many of these healing modalities do involve like the healing springs and the healing waters.
Absolutely.
Ancient warriors would go to waterfalls, things like that. So I think water is kind of special. I think we should avail ourselves of that.
I couldn't agree more. Even cold water immersion is a wonderful thing to do. There's a lot of research on hypothermic training and the benefits of it. And when we talked about resetting your dynorphins, things like that, well, being in a cold shower does the exact same thing.
That'll wake you up.
It'll wake you up, and it'll actually cue your dopaminergic reward system, so you're right on ready in the day. And actually heat training too. A lot of countries that do well academically do some type of sauna with the whole family and go in the cold. Rhonda Patrick, a neurobiologist, I think, has done a lot of work in that and how it helps people too. So that's another thing I do. I do a lot of being in the sauna and cold showers. I don't do as many, let's say, cold plunges, especially when we had some family challenges. When I was still doing a lot of cold immersion, especially ice baths, it was too much. I think it's important to understand there are times when things are too much, and just doing excessive sauna work, cold plunges, all sorts of things. And if you're in a bad place, there's a point where the stress brings about distress. And there's eustress, which is the good type of stress that helps you change and get better. But distress means you're just breaking down your system.
I think martial artists, and I'm sure people in other sports as well, are frequently too tough for our own good.
Oh my gosh, you're so right.
We push through things that you should have just dealt with a long time ago. You should have backed off. You should have sought a therapist. You should have gone to a physical therapist. But because we're so tough, we'll just keep doing it until we break down, until the body says, yeah, this is over.
It's our identity.
Yeah.
You know, it's who we are. I was talking earlier about we create our sense of self, and that's our ego. And our ego is definitely a double-edged sword. The ego gives you the motivation for driving forward towards your goals, but it also can get in the way. And I think it's important to understand what the ego is, and this is just from researching neuroscience. The idea is the ego itself, the part of the brain that creates the ego, is evolutionary newer than the rest of the brain. What we do when we have an ego is our brain creates a player character, almost like a video game. And with that abstract representation of who we are, based upon our experiences and our personality, we play it, the video game of our mind, our imagination, our what we call our working memory. It's where that inner eye where we see things, and our inner voice where we say things in our head. And we play that out, and we make simulations. And they help us figure out what to do in the future and what we could have learned from the past. That's what the ego is. So it helps us predict the future, but optimize our actions towards that future. However, one of the things they find is people who are depressed and anxious, that part of the brain, it's called the default mode, is online more than other people's. They ruminate about the past and are terrified about what comes next. So the care and feeding of the ego, or that default mode, is important. And the way I try and think about it, and the way I try and teach to my students, is this serving a future aim? Okay, then you should be thinking about yourself, thinking about those types of things. And then when it's not, move away from it. Be aware of when you're thinking about yourself. People that think more about themselves tend to be more depressed and anxious.
A recommendation for people who find themselves depressed is to get out and help other people, volunteer.
Absolutely. Get outside of yourself. Be in the present moment as best as you can. That's why meditation, mindfulness helps with depression and anxiety. Use your ego in service towards your greater self to move yourself forward, but also know when just to be aware that it's taking over too much. And when you're so tightly wound with it that all of a sudden it interferes with your life.
I've really enjoyed this time with you, Mike, and I'm really glad that you made yourself available. I know you're a very busy guy, and I hope that people will check out your school, certainly if they're in Northern California. We will place links to everything we talked about. And I also know that you're working on a book.
Yeah.
And once that book becomes available, I'll be sure my audience is well aware of it, and we can add it back into the links of this podcast. You have so much to offer, and you have changed the lives of so many people in this community. People saying that you and your wife Karen, positively affected their lives and your kids, and the role that you've had in this community. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate your time, and I don't know if you realize how impactful you've been. I mean, I've trained with you for many years, and you were one of my teachers, and one of the most impactful ones in that, as an example, you would always be the person that would find the toughest guy in the room of any belt and put yourself against them. Could be that tough blue belt who's insanely difficult for everyone, and you're the first person to fight them. And I've always held you in high regard. And there was a moment when I was a purple belt where I was doing pretty well against people above me that were higher level and people my level, but I had trouble when I had to fight that blue belt. And one of the things you had shown me is that I had to fight the blue belt. That was part of this. And I knew it was, but it was hard for me. And you had broken it down for little steps for me to be able to do that. And one of the ways was getting under him, letting the guy get to the top position, and developing a decent defense against the monster and dealing with the fear of that. And that was something directly that I learned from you, that kind of exposure therapy. And then after being able to survive, then get out and play your game. And that was a process we went through that you coached me with that was, I think, in my jiu-jitsu career, an incredibly important part. So I just wanted to thank you for that. We've had a million things together over the course of 18 years or whatever it is, but that was a very special thing that I carry with me to this day.
It's very nice to hear that. You've also been very supportive of my animal charity. You've hosted fundraisers back in the day when we were struggling, and we really appreciate that. So practical martial arts and the world you built over there is a great thing. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the discussion with Mike Valentine. If you want to check out his school, Practical Martial Arts, you can go online to pmadojo.com. And if you enjoyed the show, please remember to subscribe to our channel, comment, let us know what you're thinking, like, and share. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, a review would really help us spread the word. I'll be back next week with more lessons from the lab. And in the meantime, keep developing your strengths, your wisdom, and go out and do good in the world.